Well, it is my exceedingly great joy to wish you all a very warm welcome, wherever you are in the world joining us today. You can probably tell which of us are from Melbourne because we're the ones with the shaggy lockdown hair. If we've got our videos on, we're probably ones with the videos off because our hair is so shaggy in lockdown. Those of us from Monash University work on the land of the Kulin nations. And we want to begin this symposium by paying our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This symposium is a combined effort from the European Languages Programme at Monash University, from the Monash Crime Fiction Project, and the Monash Social Contract Research Network. And it's going to be hosted by the learned and expert Dr. Stuart King. And so I will hand straight over to Stuart now. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Chris, and welcome everyone to this webinar on crime fiction and the social contract. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, before I introduce our speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. I'd appreciate it if people could mute their microphones until we actually begin the Q&A. And if you have any questions, please post a short version via the chat function so that when we begin the Q&A, I will invite you in the order of your posts to unmute your microphone and to ask your question. And I would also be very grateful if you could please specify to whom your question is directed. Now, we have three great speakers today, and our first is Professor Andrew Pepper from Queen's University, Belfast. Now, few who work in crime fiction studies would not have encountered Andrew's many and significant publications, including the contemporary American crime novel, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2000, and Unwilling Executioner, Crime Fiction and the State, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. Andrew has also co-edited Globalization and the State in Contemporary Crime Fiction, published by Palgrave in 2016, and with me, and also Jesper Guldal, who's in the audience. He's one of the co-editors of the Routledge Companion to Crime Fiction, which came out last year. Andrew mixes theory with practice, and he's written a series of detective novels set in 19th century London, including the last days of Newgate. Andrew's talk today is titled Crime Fiction and the Unravelling of the Social Contract, Generic Breakdown at the End of the Days. Please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. And, kind of thank you to you and to Chris and to Barbara for inviting me. This is kind of new work for me, so it's kind of quite, early in its inception, and I'm still sort of trying to work the ideas out. And it sort of strikes me in places this seems a bit thin and vague, but please bear with me. So I'm just going to try and share the screen now. So can you see that? Okay. Okay, so crime fiction has always asked far-reaching questions about the durability and efficacy of the social contract. I start my 2016 book, Unwilling Executioner, by considering Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, not as an example of crime fiction per se, but in Martin Kamen's words, as where our story of crime and detection must begin. The central thesis of the book is that the development of crime fiction as a genre is propelled by the contradictions that ensue when the emerging modern state assumes control of the justice system. In Hobbesian terms, a move from the intolerable freedom of the state of nature, characterized by its war of all against all, to the security offered by the social contract is not analogous to the shift that takes place in most early crime stories, from the disorderly scene of criminal excess to the orderly scene of the law's eventual triumph, figured in or by the spectre of the scaffold. Rather, it's more helpful to think about how these early tales, even in their crudest formulations, end up responding to the threat of social breakdown by justifying a Hobbesian move from the state of nature into the social contract, while at the same time hinting at the inadequacy of the state's provision for law enforcement when confronted by exactly the kind of criminal excess and lawlessness a move into the social contract was intended to deter. What's established in these early criminal biographies, gallows speeches, judicial memoirs, and court judgments then is a tension that will become central to the development of crime fiction as an emerging genre later in the 18th and 19th centuries, namely a contradictory account of the law as both necessary for the creation and maintenance of collective life, and at the same time central to the reproduction of already entrenched social inequalities. Crucially, what these early examples of crime stories seek to project is not the bleak conditions of existence experienced by those living in poverty and abjection inside or outside the social contract, but Hobbes's uniform, unassailable, and above all, impartial system of law and punishment in which capital crimes inevitably lead to the scaffold. Still, while it might be their intention to affirm the rightness of the judgment imposed on the condemned, these tales end up betraying some anxieties about the fairness and adequacy of the justice system as a whole, and in doing so, open up a chink for the crime story to move into and inhabit. Now, this is the first move regarding crime fiction's knotty relationship to or with the social contract that I want to sketch out today. The second takes us from the earliest crime stories to the end of times, and a growing body of work which seeks to imagine or interrogate various apocalyptic scenarios. The consequences: irreversible climate change, making the planet an inhospitable place to live, nuclear wars, Hannah Jameson's The Last, and global pandemics, Lauren Bukes' Afterland, Dion Mayer's Fever, Hai Yong Pyun's The City of Ash and Red, and Chuck Wendick's The Wanderers, where whole swathes of the global population are wiped out. Now, in part, these are examples of crime writers doing what I suppose other writers of contemporary fiction have been doing since at least Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake and McCarthy's The Road, using these end-of-days scenarios not to imagine what Patron Parender calls the ruined future, but rather as frames to interrogate the here and now. We're living seemingly in pre-apocalyptic times. The climate emergency and the global spread of coronavirus are maybe the two clearest examples. And fiction, crime or otherwise, has sought to explore the various ramifications. As Peter Boxall puts it, the contemporary imagination is haunted by this prospect of planetary death, of irreversible environmental disaster. But there are complications that crime fiction, more than other genres, I think, is adept at drawing out, not simply what crime or the exemplary single dead body means in the face of impending extinction, though this is undoubtedly part of it, but also what role the investigative process, the working out of law, plays in the various adjustments to the unfolding ends of days scenarios. Now, the working out of law is not entirely synonymous with the working out of the social contract, despite obvious points of contact. Law, in one sense, means law is one of the means by which the social contract is made possible. As McCann puts it, laws and norms are the basis of ethical claims and the grounds for any vision of social justice, even if laws are also rigidly bureaucratic and the means of exploitation. In Hobbes's terms, we consent to give up a portion of our liberty in return for our security, guaranteed in part by or under law, which becomes the expression of the sovereign's authority rather than the expression of what is right or just. In many of the pre- and post-apocalyptic scenarios conjured by these crime fictions, then, the justice system, and with it, the regime of law, has collapsed and has not been adequately replaced, even if society they're fraying has not entirely disintegrated. What results in these examples is not quite the state of nature as Hobbes envisages it, a world of intolerable freedom and endemic violence, but nor is any clear-cut social contract in evidence or operation, no consensus about how to organize what remains of society, and no infrastructure for administering justice. Into the vacuum steps not the infallible detective then, the all-seeing individual who will bring order, because of course this is impossible in the wider context of the end of days, but rather a group of individuals who are sufficiently curious about what's happened and concerned by the implications of inaction, letting dead bodies rot, to want to enact some kind of investigation. Into the vacuum then steps the crime story, where the move to investigate is tied to a more general imperative to make life or to enable life, even where there would seem to be no prospect for this to occur or for society to regenerate. Hannah Jameson's The Last is not necessarily concerned with naming all of its dead. A nuclear war has laid waste to vast swathes of the global population, and those who remain at an out-of-the-way hotel in Switzerland have no idea if, as narrator John Keller puts it, we could be the last ones. All or most communication networks have broken down, and in the first few pages we learn of numerous suicides, 2 dead bodies hanging in the stairwell and 2 more who jump off the hotel roof. Death stalks the narrative, which in turn is organized around 2 related propositions. The first is survival, how to organize collectively and individually in order to sustain life and pass out the scarce resources, notably food. The second, for Keller at least, is the urge to find out what happened to a young girl of about 7 or 8 years old, who they discover in a rooftop water tank with a lid so heavy it would have been impossible for her to enter it unaided. Either something to occupy the time then, a hobby, as one survivor puts it, or some kind of ethical act. Don't you feel we should find out who she is, or who she was, Keller says, and a little later, we can't stop caring about right or wrong just because, to which someone responds, it's the end of the world. And Keller replies, we're still here. The question of whether, in the face of the apparent destruction of the world, it really matters what happens to the girl hovers over the subsequent investigation conducted by Keller and others. As a narrative device, the investigation gives the novel a recognizable feel. Already, the isolated hotel with a limited cast of characters conjures the spectre of the Golden Age mystery. Revelations about missing suitcases and security footage and cover-ups and the suspicious activities of the hotel staff remind us that we're reading crime fiction, where the expectation of answers propels the narrative and sustains our interest. But no one seems to much care about the girl, even Keller, and perhaps also us as readers. What I'm doing might not matter, Keller muses. And in one sense, it doesn't. And when we do finally get an explanation, it is at best anticlimactic. Still, this doesn't mean the crime plot serves no purpose, because in one sense, the fact we're still here matters. The rudiments of investigation and the task of forging a new community out of the remnants are in some senses the same. The imperative of the crime and post-apocalyptic genres are melded insofar as both are organized around a set of ethical claims about how to live in the face of death, analogized by the spectre of the dead body or multiple dead bodies. In other words, it's not the revelation that matters per se, but the mobilizing of support for the notion that looking into the death matters, which is the same for the mixture of directives and consensus building that takes place in other spheres of hotel life. This in turn speaks to the reconfiguration of the social contract outside of law, which has no presence or sanction in Jameson's half-destroyed world. In case this notion of consensus building and participation sounds too much like a liberal wet dream, Jameson reminds us of its fraught agonistic aspects. When Miller alleges that another survivor, Nick, has attempted to rape her, the group need to decide how to respond, not perhaps whether to believe Miller or not, though this issue is raised, but how to most effectively punish the crime, both from the perspective of the victim and for the wider group, because if they exile him, some fear he'll return and possibly bring others with him. The decision to execute him, to shoot him, is swift, an example of summary justice perhaps, since there's no time for a trial, but also the product of discussion and voting. Here, the combination of the crime story's need for justice with the post-apocalyptic genre's emphasis on security brings into focus the lingering traces of the social contract. But the shooting itself, which is messy and problematic insofar as the body then disappears, is a mark of failure rather than success or consummation, and a reminder of a world a little like ours, defined by imperfection, contingency, ambivalence, and doubt. Now, what interests me here is how the shape and form of the crime story, its more typical aspects and trajectories, is transformed by the context and subject it seeks to portray, and how it's melding with other genres, in this instance, the post-apocalyptic story, allows it to explore new possibilities and new forms of knowledge, even amidst a more general landscape of impossibility and failure. What does justice matter in the face of near universal death? Here, the whittling down of survivors, some disappear, others commit suicide, marks not the and then there were none logic of the isolated country house mystery, where a last-minute intervention on the part of the detective will return things to normal, but a more deep-seated and irresolvable sadness and melancholia associated with species extinction and human life coming to an end. Or does it? Because in the end, Jameson's Last, I think, loses its nerve, or the demands of the post-apocalyptic form, with its emphasis on rebuilding a new sustainable community amidst the rubble, take over. Because those left behind at the Swiss hotel, of course, are not the last. There are others living in a nearby city who've set up a new community with a mayor and a council, with an emphasis on sustainable food production and a barter economy. The centre holds, and the social contract endures, and with it the fundamentals of the crime story. Only at this point is the killer of the girl found and punished. A future is once again possible, a telos that doesn't only lead to death. But in pushing the narrative down this path, Jameson ends up rerouting her novel back towards the generic mainstream. The emphasis on resilience and rebuilding, the social contract reimagined, is also present in Dion Meyer's The Fever, translated from the Afrikaans by K.L. Seegers. The fever in question is, rather presciently, given Meyer published this in 2017, a lab-manufactured coronavirus, which wipes out 90% of the world's population. So I guess we're lucky here. Meyer is a renowned crime writer, but to call Fever a crime novel may well be a misnomer. At first glance, it's better designated as a straight post-apocalyptic novel in the manner of, say, McCarthy's The Road, insofar as it's a story about a father and son's journey across the South African veldt to look for life and their roles in settling a new community with others who haven't been killed by the virus. There is crime in this new settlement, and it is dealt with by the social contract and mechanisms of law and governance established. But the frame of the crime novel, or the thriller, is reimposed at the end when it's revealed that the coronavirus was deliberately released by an environmental sect led by the boy's mother in order to wipe out enough of the world's population to ensure the planet's survival. What interests me about these novels is not the rebuilding, though Meyer's account of this is gripping and well handled, but rather how the form has to shapeshift in the face of the impossibility of the context faced by those left behind, a move that is mitigated and lessened in this case by the success of the new community. More daring in this respect is Chuck Wendick's Wanderers, where the mystery relates to the provenance of a growing collection of sleepwalkers, individuals who seemingly without reason or explanation are turned into zombie figures and make their way en masse, needing no rest, across the US, and who cannot be restrained even by using force. In a conventional thriller, the source of the malady would be investigated and identified, and those who mysteriously become sleepwalkers would be rescued, their lives restored. But against a backdrop of a country unraveling along familiar left-right, urban-rural, religious-secular fault lines, the sleepwalkers and their protectors, family members who become known as shepherds, and those from the Center of Disease Control who are examining them, form their own community at odds with and despised by those dwelling in the rural heartlands they pass through. The solution to the mystery of the sleepwalkers, which constitutes the culmination of a multi-pronged investigation carried out by disease control specialists, brings no comfort or indeed narrative resolution, but rather sends the narrative spinning along an entirely new trajectory. The sleepwalkers have ingested, unknowingly to them, microprocessors which shut off mental capacities and augment physical prowess in order to offer protection against a virus for which there is no cure. Hence, a novel that started off as an amalgam mystery, thriller, conspiracy story is transformed by the looming apocalyptic scenario into one where the social contract fails and things fall apart. Not only does a right-wing coup use the virus's spread to topple the government, but the end of humanity also looms. In the context of a fast-spreading coronavirus that will kill everyone on the planet, a story about biomedical conspiracy and the mystery of the sleepwalkers is infused, I think, with a genuine sadness as character after character succumb to the virus. What we might call a generic impulse to explain or rationalize can't take root because the conditions do not or cannot allow it, at least until the final few pages where a possible cure is stumbled on. Now, my interest here is part of a larger project I'm calling defective fictions, or narratives that don't work. By do not work, I mean they're not artistic or aesthetic or even generic failures, far from it. These are unruly, inventive, shape-shifting texts where the hybrid impulse is tied to the impossibility of achieving answers or resolutions in any one frame, or because the answers or resolutions are circumstantially or contextually impossible. If racial justice is impossible within the confines of the realist police procedural form, for example, writers must find new forms to explore what may or may not be possible. Defective is a near homonym, of course, for detective, indicating the ongoing centrality of crime fiction to the task of mapping and interrogating these new worlds. Not just the genre's global reach, then, but its impulse to name, to investigate, to explain, which can only go so far. In the case of Wanderers, the solution to the mystery of the sleepwalkers doesn't resolve the narrative. Rather, the thriller's gradual mutation into a story of the apocalypse unravels its constitutive parts to the point that it and its characters have nowhere left to go. To put this another way, it's not an aesthetic impulse that drives this kind of generic mutation, a need or desire on the part of writers to innovate. Rather, it's because to tell the story they need or want to tell in a single generic frame or register is impossible. The story of mutation and adaptation is driven by a search for new ways of framing and interrogating problems that are global in scale and where failure would seem to be inevitable. The never-ending war on drugs, the ongoingness of racial violence and the impossibility of achieving racial justice, the growing threat of climate change, and the life-threatening specter of global pandemics. As things fall apart, as consensus fails, as the social contract unravels, new amalgam forms are made and remade at the intersections of genres. It isn't that these fictions are defective or broken in themselves, but in their engagement with what is broken, they have to find new ways to represent this failure. In Laurent Ballant's terms, the waning of genre, or at least the older realist genres, we might call, the detective or crime story, an example of these, I don't know, and the emergence of new hybrid forms in the face of changing socio-political realities, frames different kinds of openings, as she puts it, within and beyond the impasse of adjustment that constant crisis creates. In other words, this is not a matter of fiction responding to crisis in order to somehow solve or overcome or move beyond the conditions which have caused this crisis in the first place. Rather, I'm interested in the ways new hybrid genre forms have evolved or mutated in such a way as to register the ongoingness of crisis as a way of adjusting to this ongoingness. Okay, by way of conclusion then, I'd like to say a few words about an amazing novel I've just finished by Hae-Young Pyun called City of Ash and Red, translated from the Korean by Sora Kim Russell and originally published in 2010. What I'm especially excited about is the way Pyun brings together the frames of the crime or detective story and what we might call pandemic noir to show a society unraveling at its seams, where the former genres push towards some kind of revelation and possibly some kind of justice is utterly bamboozled and undone by the conditions unleashed by an airborne virus that strips away the social bonds in country C to the point where killing rats and humans achieves a grim equivalence. The novel's nameless protagonist, a mid-level executive in a pest eradication firm, is seconded by his company to country C for an indeterminate period. Upon arrival, he's forced to quarantine and then is told not to come into work at all. Confined to his apartment and without his luggage, which is stolen even before he's checked in. He phones an acquaintance back home, a man who's married his ex-wife, only to discover that the ex-wife has been murdered in his apartment and he is the main suspect. Now, in crime fiction, we've seen this kind of narrative before, where the apparently trustworthy and even inconsequential main character is gradually revealed to be something other than what he first seems. In this case, someone easily capable of acts of extreme brutality. The unmasking of the protagonist as murderer produces its own generic ruptures, of course, as we see in novels as different as Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and Jim Thompson's The Killer Inside Me. The rupturing of bonds of sympathy between reader and protagonist, its own contract, I suppose, preempts and is further indicative of a more general sense of dissatisfaction or disaffection, which is threaded through narratives that tend to lead either to punishment or death. But what of The City of Ash and Red? The nameless protagonist flees his quarantine apartment and is forced to live off scraps while sleeping rough in a park as the contagion spreads and society grinds to a more general halt. Now, I'm still not sure what to do with the novel's careful thematizations of misogyny, which, as we find out, underpin the man's treatment of his wife while they're married, and of course, in the final act of killing her, which is never kind of fully nailed down. But the same resilience that allows the man to blot out his wife's murder and escape to country C also enables him to survive amidst the pandemic and the rats. As an employee, as an ex-employee of a pest control firm, the man decides to spend his days capturing and killing rats with his bare hands. A Sisyphusian task at best, because rats, as we learn, can reproduce far, far more quickly than humans can kill them. But his exploits bring him to the attention of a pest eradication firm in country C, which takes him on as an undocumented worker. His final act is to kill, accidentally, but perhaps not, a housewife who has retained his company's services and whose death, one among so many others amidst the contagion, is not even registered by the end of the narrative and hence goes unpunished. Here then, the social bonds envisaged by Hobbes to protect individuals from wanton violence crumble in the face of societal breakdown caused by a viral contagion that is never brought under control. In this context, the act of killing rats and people finds a disturbing equivalence. And with the rat population expanding beyond society's capacity to eradicate it, and with a viral contagion circulating unchecked, no resolution to either narrative, that of the murder or the pandemic, is possible. So I will leave it there for now. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. That was a great opening discussion of our topic. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to save up questions for the Q&A. If you have any questions, please do put a shortened version in the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to them in time. But thank you very much for that, Andrew. We'll now move on to my dear colleague, Dr. Barbara Bezzotti. Barbara teaches in Italian studies in the European languages major at Monash University, and she's one of the leading scholars of Italian crime fiction, as well as one of the pioneers of the internationalization of crime fiction studies. She is the sole author of 3 monographs on Italian crime fiction: The Importance of Place in Contemporary Italian Crime Fiction, A Bloody Journey, published by Fairleigh Dickinson University Press in 2012, Politics and Society in Italian Crime Fiction and Historical Overview, published by Macfarlane in 2014, and Investigating Italy's Past Through Crime Fiction, Films and TV Series, Murder in the Age of Chaos, published by Palgrave in 2016. Barbara has also co-edited 3 important collections, the Foreign and International Crime Fiction, Transcultural Representations from 2012, Serial Crime Fiction, Dying for More, a great title from 2015, and Blood on the Table, Essays on Food in International Crime Fiction from 2018. And she's currently working on a book on Mediterranean crime fiction. Barbara's talk today is titled How the Social Contract Has Failed Women. Please make her welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. This is a very nice introduction. I'm trying to share my screen. Okay. Can see. Is it the right one? Let me see. Yay. Okay, there you go. I'm not, as you can probably detect from my publications, I'm not really an expert in gender studies and crime fiction. So my presentation today is more the presentation of a fan of crime fiction, a fan of these books. So I recognize a lot of names in the audience, and I will be very happy to hear from you and give me feedback on this, because it's really something more out of my heart than my expertise. Okay, so femicide and the evil of patriarchal society that feeds violence against women are at the core of much crime fiction. And this may come as a surprise, as crime fiction has been long been accused of being a conservative genre that reaffirms the social order and endorses, in fact, a patriarchal society. However, this view is being challenged by a number of crime novels which successfully denounce violence against women. And in my presentation, I will analyze the representation of gender violence and femicide in Duchess Marani's Voci, 1994, translated as Voices, 1997, Maria Antonia Oliver's Studi en Lila, 1985, translated as A Study in Lilac, 2001, and Stig Larsson's, and forgive my pronunciation of Swedish, Men som attar Kvinnor, 2005, translated as The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, 2008. I will show how these crime novelists use the crime genre to shift the reader's attention from an individual crime and an individual culprit to point to a systematic failure of Western culture and society and the social contract that pinpoints them. Ultimately, I show how crime fiction can act as a privileged genre for exposing how the social contract has failed women. Because of its focus on identity of a victim, witness, suspect, or perpetrator, crime fiction is a particularly suitable medium to engage with conflicts, asymmetrical power relationships, and gender and violence issues. Recent scholarship has highlighted the contribution of the genre in dealing with political, social, and genre issues. It has also indicated the flexibility and porosity of the genre that allows the genre to rework and transform itself and transform its own conventions. The representation of women as detectives, victims, villains have been analyzed by seminal works, and the debate has been lively. For example, drawing her conclusions from an analysis of the representation of women in Anglophone crime fiction, Kathleen Gregory Klein argues that it is an inherently conservative and paternalistic genre, insofar as, she argues, women are generally represented either as victims or femme fatale, that is, seductive women who are likely to cause distress or disaster to a man, and generally the detective, who become involved with them. On the other side of the barricade, Maureen Reddy claims the genre may give, in fact, space to a subversive observation of traditional social roles. And according to Heilbron, this is the case in feminist American hardboiled fiction. Hardboiled fiction is a tough and unsentimental style of crime writing characterized by graphic sex and violence, vivid but often sordid urban backgrounds, and fast-paced dialogue. Since the 1980s, feminist crime writers have rewritten the hard-boiled crime novel by turning the male detective, a violent, cynical, and often misogynistic character, into an empowered female sleuth. In this kind of crime fiction, women detectives, especially private eyes, and I'm quoting from Reddy, must face not only the widespread corruption of society, but they must repeatedly reestablish the right even to engage in the detective struggle against evil. Irons stresses the importance of having feminist heroes appear in popular fiction, as well as the crucial role in speaking to the collective dreams and myths of a society, empowering especially women. And finally, Worthington claims that feminist crime fiction importantly locates the job of the detective simply as one of the previously male-dominated professions, such as the law, the police, medicine, politics, and business, to which women are claiming equal access and in which they could demonstrate equal efficiency and achieve equal success. And this is what I have read recently, an article about the Scully effect, and it's about the X-Files TV series, and one of the two protagonists, Agent Scully, is a woman, and she's a scientist, and apparently after the great success of the X-Files, a lot of young women have pursued a career in science. Okay, I was, sorry, also a big fan of X-Files. So far, the focus have been on feminist crime fiction of the 1980s, and mainly feminist crime fiction from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Tonight, I would like to talk about three novels, one originally published in the 1980s, one in the 1990s, and one in the 2000s, which belong to different national traditions, which also give a fundamental contribution to this topic, as they do not only give accounts of inequality issues women face in their private life and workplace, but also tackle specifically gender violence. And in this way, I hope to show that beyond an undeniable misogynistic and voyeuristic output, crime fiction can also display a transnational and ongoing commitment to exposing gender violence by making use of and rewriting its own conventions. So I'm starting with Italy because it's the one I feel more comfortable with. Dacia Maralini's Voices is a 1994 crime novel in which the identification of one of the key figures in crime fiction, the detective, who is in this case a female detective, with another key figures, such as the equally female victim, is pivotal in pointing out patriarchy as the real culprit of a phenomenon like femicide that almost 30 years after the publication of Marini's book still occupies the front pages of newspaper in Italy and all over the world. Voce starts with the first-person narrator, Michela Canova, a journalist from a private radio station in Rome, Italy, coming back home after a short absence. Upon her return, Michela finds that her neighbor, the actress Angela Bari, has been murdered. Back at work, Michela is asked by her boss to research a radio series on violent crimes against women, and particularly unsolved crimes. This professional investigation proceeds hand in hand with a much more personal inquiry into the death of her neighbors. The police are involved, but the book is centered on Michela's investigation, and she interviews and records the voices, hence the title of the novel, of the victim's family, friends, and witnesses. From the start, it is obvious that the victim's gender is relevant and that Angela's death is a sex crime. While researching for her radio series, Michela reads several newspaper articles on unsolved murders, both in Italy and abroad. Lists of cases punctuate the narrative, contextualizing Angela's murder, which is soon seen not as an isolated case, but part of a larger phenomenon that affects Western culture at large. At the same time, the radio interviews Michela has with male psychologists, experts of human behavior, and doctors reveal degrees of misogyny or gender blindness in dealing with sexual violence. To these views, which mainly confine femicide to mental illness, the narrator contrasts the idea of femicide as a pervasive evil in Western society and a gangrene much more difficult to eradicate as it is rooted in patriarchy. Michela's investigation into the victim's family also brings to the surface the detective repressed memories, and with them her own experience of oppression. In particular, an interview with Lodovica, the victim's sister, who has grown up with an abusive stepfather, triggers in Michela some deeply hidden memories, which put at the center of the narrative the figure of the cruel, all-powerful father god and violence, including sexual violence within the family. So through an identification between the female detective and the female victim, a recurrent theme in the novel, in Voci, the victim is placed at the center of the story, making the discourse on femicide and incest, because there is also this subplot, extremely powerful. As Joanne Kenyon observes, in highlighting that all women can be called upon to act out the role of victims, Voci identifies not simply one man, but a patriarchy as the real culprit. Femicide and incest are also at the core of Stieg Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Interestingly, the literal translation of the Swedish title is, in fact, Men Who Hate Women. And I realized that I put it in my abstract, Men Who Hate Women, instead of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. As Cecilia Ovesdotter Alm and Anna Westerstall-Stemport argue, the novel, I'm quoting, reflects implicitly and explicitly gaps before rhetoric and practice in Swedish policy and public discourse about complex relations between welfare state retrenchment, neoliberal corporate and economic practices, and politicized gender constructions. In this novel, journalist Michael Blomqvist and computer hacker Lisbeth Salander investigate a cold case, the disappearance of a young woman, Harriet Wenger, a scion of one of the Sweden's wealthiest family, who vanished over 40 years before. During the investigation, Blomqvist and Salander realized that before disappearing, Harriet had been repeatedly raped by her father, and that Gottfried Wenger was also responsible for the ritual rape and murder of several young women. Interestingly, Gottfried initiated Harriet's brother, Martin Wenger, into rape and murder of women before his own death. This initiation is symbolic of a culture where violence against women is not a result of isolated events performed by sick minds, but is rooted in a society, an alleged liberal society, an alleged advanced society, in which religious conservatism and right-wing movements still feed patriarchy and misogyny. Like Voices, the novel is punctuated by statistics about violence against women. So giving the idea that it is a transnational issue. Interestingly, like the protagonist of Voci, Salander also experienced family violence as a child. Moreover, after an unnecessary commitment to a psychiatric clinic, she was placed under a legal guardian, and the man, her legal guardian, who represented the Swedish state and should have protected her, raped her. So Salander is not only physically abused, but she is in fact a victim of institutional rape. So in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the identification of key roles in crime fiction goes further than in Voci. So we have a detective and a victim, like Michela Canova. Salander is also a perpetrator. So she gets revenge on her legal guardian by assaulting, humiliating, and blackmailing him. She also does not intervene and lets Martin Wenger die in his car after a chase at the end of the novel. Like Voices, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo shifts the reader attention from individual crimes, Harriet Wenger's sexual abuse and Salander's history of violence, to point to a systematic failure of the state. In this case, the Swedish welfare state's failure to protect women from violence. The novel suggests that both in the case of Harriet, who kills her father and fakes, in fact, her own death in order to escape further violence from her brother and find refuge in Australia, and Salander, these two women had to resort to taking justice into their own hands because official justice and the state failed to protect them. So the last novel that I would like to analyze if we have time. Yep. Is Maria Antonia Oliver's Studying Lilac, whose year of publication placed it among the first examples of feminist hardboiled fiction, even though this novel is scarcely mentioned in studies of the feminist hardboiled. This novel is inspired by a series of campaigns and protests that took place on Barcelona streets in 1977 and 1978 against gender violence in Catalonia. These protests denounced a legal system that was still markedly averse to female victims of sexual violence. One of the most provocative slogans that appeared following these protests was "Contra violació, castració," against rape, castration, in lilac-colored graffiti on Barcelona's buildings, which became a call to action against male rapists, hence the title of the novel. So, set in Barcelona, Studying Lilac presents two plots that coalesce around the ubiquitous crime of rape. Concentrating on the second plot strand, in which the private detective Lonia Guyu is hired by antique dealer Elena Gaudí to identify and locate three men who allegedly defrauded her. At the end of the novel, the detective realizes that Elena was raped by these men and hired the detective in order to identify a rapist and take revenge on them. Guyu catches Elena in the act of removing the male body part that was used to victimize her. The detective allows Elena to extract her own form of justice and escape undetected. In this novel, the victim, Elena, is also a perpetrator, and the detectives become complicit in Elena's revenge. In other words, we find a further variation of the blurring of the roles of victim, villain, and detective. Doubling Elena as both victim and criminal, the author of Studying Lilac provides the narrative space for rape victims to tell their stories and allows for an alternative form of justice to triumph. Like in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, in this novel, the female detective develops her own moral code, which effectively supplements what is perceived as an ineffectual social system. Like Voices and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Studying Lilac offers its reader an extended critique of rape as a social institution that happens in Spain because men, imbued with a patriarchal culture exacerbated by over 30 years of Francoist dictatorship, consider it their right, and because they assume they can get away with it. The novel also explores several options for how women might respond to the systemic sexual victimization of themselves and others. And as Nina Molinaro argues, and I'm quoting, the moral Oliver's novels may be that rape necessitates women's individual resistance and collective solidarity, both of which exact a price precisely because justice and crime are gender biased. So in conclusion, by blurring the boundaries among three key roles in crime fiction, the victim, the detective, and the villain, Maraini, Larson, and Oliver contextualized the evil of femicide and rape, showing that far from being merely a matter for psychiatrists, it has profound roots in Western culture. They describe it as a pervasive evil in contemporary society, not identifiable with the deviant personalities, but resulting from enduring retrograde culture and flaws in institutions, the law, and government actions or inaction, which fails to protect women's life, while the protection of life is one of the pinpoints of the social contract. Ultimately, this brief analysis shows that not only does crime fiction need to be considered transnationally, but that crime fiction per se can be a privileged space in exposing how the social contract has failed women. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Barbara. I'm always excited. We've had two presentations dealing with transnational crime fiction, which is always exciting for me. And as a Catalanist, I was very pleased to see Maria Antonia Oliver's novel getting the attention that I think it deserves. Our final presenter today is Dr. Carlos Uxó. Carlos is a Latin Americanist who specializes in contemporary Cuban literature. In the crime fiction sphere, Carlos is the author of the monograph El Género Policial en Cuba, The Crime Genre in Cuba, which was published earlier this year by Peter Lang. And in 2006, he edited a collection of essays on the detective fiction of Leonardo Padura Fuentes, the most well-known Cuban crime writer. More recently, he has contributed the chapter on crime fiction and authoritarianism to the Routledge Companion to Crime Fiction. And Carlos's talk today is titled Maintaining the Revolutionary Social Contract, the Role of Cuban Television Police Shows. Please welcome Carlos. Please share your screen, Carlos.
There we go. Thank you, Stuart. And I guess the advantage of being the third speaker is that one can start to make connections with previous speakers. I'll make two brief connections with something that Andrew said earlier. And fortunately, my connection with Barbara is non-existent because there is not one Cuban novel or crime fiction police series that deals with femicide, which in itself is quite interesting, as I will discuss later. I guess in my presentation, I'm going to talk about three things. First, I'll talk a little bit about the social contract in Cuba, or views of the social contract in Cuba. And then I'll talk briefly about what Rousseau says about the law in his book, The Social Contract. And I finally will talk about a Cuban television police series, The Law and the Social Contract. And because there are many police series, I will be talking about Tras la Huella, which has been broadcast for the last 15 years. Now, I think very soon they are going to commemorate the 15 years on show. I guess when we talk about the social contract, very often in Cuban studies, we find very polarized discussions, and this one is not an exception. So we will have, on the one hand, people like Mario Juan Valdez, who talks about the new Cuban social contract. And his view is that with the fall of the Soviet Union, the ensuing crisis and changes in the Cuban economic model, all that has made the revolutionary social contract void, and a new social contract is needed. I guess for those of you who are not very familiar with Cuban history, very quickly, immediately after the Soviet Union collapse, Cuba entered into what was called the special period, which was the biggest crisis Cuba has had to face. They had to change a lot of things in their economic model, somehow accepting some level of capitalism in their model. That definitely saved the revolution from their point of view. But now, 30 years later, we are seeing another huge wave of crisis, which I guess some of you may have seen at the events of the 11th of July, just a couple of months ago or 3 months ago, when for the first time in the history of the revolution, there were widespread riots in Cuba and confrontations of the police for the first time, huge demonstrations of people chanting freedom, freedom, which I think has we can link what I'm going to say with those demonstrations and those issues. So on the one hand, we have people who say the new social contract is needed. It's completely broken. This is the view, for example, also of Haroldo Dilla, a very well-known Cubanist, who says the Cuban revolutionary regime derives a portion of its legitimacy from the social pact between population and leadership, which prescribes the provision of free education, health services, and social security in exchange for unconditional regime loyalty. He wrote that in 2007. He goes on to say that once that it is obvious that in times of crisis that Cuba cannot provide especially social security to the population, the social pact is broken. I guess from their point of view, since the social contract is based on a quid pro quo exchange with individuals giving up some of their individual rights to a central government or authority in return for the benefits of collective security, order, and well-being, if there is no quid provided by the government, individuals are under no obligation to surrender anything or contribute their quo. That's the point of view of this. I guess we could relate this briefly to what Minouche Shafik said. This is not from her latest book on the social contract, but a previous one, where he says John Locke's view was that the purpose of the social contract was to preserve the lives, freedoms, and well-being of citizens. Thus, if the sovereign failed to protect those rights, it was legitimate for citizens to revolt and create a new political society. I think that is linked to what Aroldo Dia said, and it may be linked also to the events of the 11th of July. So if the social contract is broken, obviously you can revolt against the government and create a new social contract. Sitting on the other side of this debate, we find, for example, Ricardo Ronquillo. He writes for Juventud Rebelde. Juventud Rebelde is the official organ of the communist youth. Although looking at his photo, may have chosen the wrong place to write. But anyway, from his point of view, Cuba has gone through 3 social contracts already. Cuba has gone through 3 social contracts. This is their 3rd social contract. The first one came with the passing of the Fundamental Law of the Republic of Cuba in February 1959, the second one with the Cuban Constitution, February 1976, and the 3rd one with a very recent approval in referendum of the new Cuban Constitution in February 2019. So for him, there's not been one social contract. There has been 3 social contracts that have been created. Andrew earlier talked about the ongoingness of crisis. So in a sense, I think that Ricardo Ronquillo is accepting that ongoingness of crisis. But on the other hand, I find this is a very legalistic approach to social contract, to the point that I wonder whether Ronquillo really understands the concept of social contract, which is not equivalent to law, even if it's the most important law, even if you're talking about the most important law in a given jurisdiction. But the social contract includes unwritten trust and implicit expectations too. To quote Chris Watkin in another video of this series, he said that the social contract is not about keeping the law, but keeping the trust. Law requires trust, but trust doesn't rest upon law. I think Ronquillo has missed that completely, and he views that if there's a law, there's a social contract that is working well. Julio Carranza, sitting sort of in between those 2 positions, is an economist that he says the Cuban process must reach a new pact with each generation. And again, we're going back to the ongoingness of crisis. The same pact cannot be transferred in terms of expectations and spaces from one generation to the next. While the principles remain, national sovereignty, social justice, economic and democratic development, everything else is open to discussion and change. So he has a more flexible view of social contract as something that needs to be recreated constantly. I found also, when I've been looking at social contract in Cuba, another way of looking at the social contract that I find very interesting. I've been interested to know if other people who are more experts in social contract than I am have found something similar. It's a very restrictive and limiting understanding of social contract. Social contract seen as sort of an umbrella, not only an umbrella under which you are safe, an umbrella that if you move out of the umbrella, you're on your own, and the state is not going to protect you. You have decided to leave society, so to speak. And this person, Dimitrov, talks about that in the context of the letters to the editor that were they started publishing in the main newspaper in Granma in the early 2000s for the first time. And he says that many letters of the editor to the editor left out many topics which were not to be discussed in public. Someone has made a connection with, for example, in relation to what Barbara was saying earlier, to the silencing of gender violence in socialist patriarchy in Cuban literature in specific, but we will see that that also happens in the police series that I'm going to talk about later. So in the sense, social contract is also establishes limits. You cannot move away from that because that's you are rocking the boat a bit too much, or you cannot discuss things that we don't want to be discussed, so to speak. Very quickly, let's see what Rousseau said about the law. In the book second of his book second, chapter 6 about the law, he says, by the social compact, which is the other word he is for contract, we have given existence and life to the body politic. The question now is to endow it with movement and will by legislation. So obviously the problem for him is legislation, but the main problem, if we need legislation, is who is going to create the legislation. So he wonders, how will the laws be determined? Will it be by the common agreement, by a sudden inspiration? Has the body politic an organ for expressing its will? Who will give it the foresight necessary to frame its acts and publish them at the outset? Or how shall it declare them in the hour of need? How would a blind multitude, which often knows not what it wishes because it rarely knows what is good for it, execute by itself an enterprise so great, so difficult as a system of legislation? That is the question he asked, and I found his answer is extremely interesting for our case, our Cuban case. He says, both individuals and the public equally need guidance. Individuals must be obliged to subordinate their will to their reason. The public must be taught to recognize what it desires, hence the necessity of a lawgiver. I have seen in some translations, instead of lawgiver, they use legislator, but I prefer to keep the word lawgiver because I think it emphasizes also the top to bottom approach to social contract that I think we have in Cuba today. And in this sentence, there are a couple of things that interest me. First, the public need guidance. You need someone telling the public what to do, which I think fits very well with the idea of the vanguard, the mass that Cuba has accepted or as part of their ideology, obviously taken from Lenin. And the second, the public must be taught. I think that is very important because as we are going to see, the crime fiction in general in Cuba, and very specifically this television series, has an extremely didactic approach. This is not crime fiction, just entertainment. We are giving people guidance and we are teaching people what the social compact pact is about. This is what we believe the social pact should be. And this is what we are going to teach every Sunday at primetime television. Cuba started creating television series very early. The first ones are in the 60s. The very first ones were mostly, as you would expect, Cubans versus American spies. So it was very close to more space, agents arriving in Cuba or Cuban agents going to America. In the 80s, it started to change until we have today this series, the final one, Tras la Huella, which, as I said, has been on television, this broadcast for more than 15 years. So Tras la Huella has more than 200 episodes, and I must admit, I must be the only person outside Cuba that has watched more than 230. Today, I reached my 236th episode of Tras la Huella, which sometimes is fun, sometimes not that much fun. But it is also very important that it is broadcast always on Sunday at 8:30. So it's prime time when we are telling our citizens what is a crime, how we are going to prosecute the crime, and what impact that has on the kind of social contract that we want in Cuba. To give you a very brief idea of how, I can't reach my, of how it starts. So the first thing you with this fantastic music is it's a warning that this is based in real facts. I think this is very important because it's telling you this is not in the, if we put crime fiction together, this is not, it's a lot more about crime than about fiction. It's a fictionalized view of, but a real event. So don't take this too lightly. This is very, this could be you in one of the future episodes. The second thing that is important is that this series is produced, written, and at the end of the credits, you see a lot of army personnel by the Ministry of Interior. So the cases are real. They are selected by the government or by the ministry. And obviously, someone is deciding which crimes they are going to choose for the series at different times of the in the 15 years of the series. And what I find also interesting is how it ends. Oops, sorry.
Tribunal Provincial Popular.
So this is what happens at the end of every episode.
Sancionó a los participantes como listeros, colectores, empleados de mesa y mensajeros con privación de libertad entre 2 y 5 años. También resultó sancionado por el mismo.
So you can hear the sentences that were given to those people. It's real names, sometimes filmed in real location, and telling you
para los portadores de armas de fuego,
the sentences they received. And always with a crescendo until you get to the last sentence, which is
conjunta de privación de libertad se incrementó hasta los 10 años. El propio tribunal, tomando en consideración que el ciudadano Juan Carlos Martínez Blanco es el autor intelectual de los delitos de juegos prohibidos, corrupción de menores, cohecho y tenencia ilegal de armas de fuego, acordó sancionarlo de forma conjunta a 20 años de privación de libertad.
So normally there's a crescendo where you start with the lesser sentences until you get someone being sentenced to 20 years in jail. And but there's obviously apart from the all the paraphernalia, it is quite interesting how it is produced to some extent create fear also in the possible in the what can happen to criminals that may be watching the show. I find that series like Tras la Huella construct and then socialize the idea of the criminal, of how policing and crime repression is to be carried out, and the role, very importantly, the role ordinary citizens have to play in relation to these issues, and more importantly, in the context of this talk, in maintaining the current social contract as is. While the first Cuban television series, especially those broadcast before the 1980s, portrayed the USA and the counter-revolution as the enemies of the revolution, creating a grand narrative of the revolution, always fair, always triumphant, at war with capitalism, series Tras la Huella have increasingly focused on what until recently would have seen minor offenses, which I found very interesting. Thus, the initial grand narrative painted with layers of heroism, epic struggles, inexhaustible commitment gives way to a humble and somehow unremarkable fight that this time brings police face to face mostly with petty criminals that potentially could be any viewer, as I'll explain in a second. Many of the criminals are actually not professionals, but ordinary citizens who have seized an opportunity for their own benefit, putting their individual needs or desires before the collective greater good. I have done one of the advantages of having so many episodes where the information at the end is very clear is that it allows you to do things like this. I have gone more than 240 episodes, and I have seen how many times someone is sentenced to death sentence, life in prison, 30 years, 20 to 29 years. There's only 4 episodes, or 3% of the ones that I have seen, that end in a death sentence, and that has not happened for quite a few years. So it was at the very beginning of the series. Importantly for me, more recently, I have seen that more and more of the sentences are here. So the enemy is not the mass murderer. That doesn't really matter anymore. The enemy is small crime. People who they can see they can steal something and they do, or they witness an embezzlement in their workplace and they don't do anything. So it's small crooks, so to speak. And the second thing I have looked at is, and this will interest maybe Barbara, is the type of crime that we see in this series. And for me, the most interesting, and I want to put attention, well, first, no, you will not find femicide, for example. It does not exist, apparently, in Cuba. There are a few episodes where there is rape, but there is nothing similar, no domestic violence at all. And I remember seeing a couple of episodes where maybe for me from Australia, looking at that, thinking, I thought in the end that someone is going to go to jail for domestic violence. But no, it's like there's theft, there's something else, but there is never domestic violence. It's never mentioned. But also very important is in the context of the social contract is that increasingly we see episodes that deal with these crimes, black market, buying stolen goods, failure to properly take care of public property, failure to report a crime. It's more, you hardly see them 15 years ago, and now it's emphasized all the time. You have failed to report a crime, petty theft, and other very Cuban illegal slaughter of cattle, which I don't know if you know that years ago, if you kill a cow, you would go to jail for longer than from killing a person, actually. So it's a very serious crime. But for me, or for any Cuban looking at this list, is that 99% of Cubans every single day engage in the black market. And a lot of them buy, you don't know they're stolen, but you buy things from someone who offers them to you. So these are activities that the government or the Ministry of Interior thinks that this is now the core of the problem in Cuba. Since the Cuban communist system is based on a society of solidarity, what they are emphasizing is that we are losing that solidarity, if you want, and that is that small amount of crimes that are going to undermining our social contract. And so it's a call for ordinary citizens to, if you want, to go back to the origins of the revolution. So to be more strict in their day-to-day activities. And I think that's all I wanted to say. It's just interesting that there are crimes that have not appeared, I think, as much as the change of crimes that are now appearing on television. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks to all our presenters. I think it's fascinating how we've got two presentations which deal with the state not only doesn't provide safety for its citizens, but it also is responsible for creating the conditions in which the social contract breaks down. And then we've got the Cuban case with very much, as Carlos said, it's sort of a top-heavy. There's this faith in the government to provide justice for all of us. Now, I'll move us to questions, and I believe Eric is first in line. So, Eric, do you want to ask your question directly?
Sure. I have to say how much I enjoyed using the chat box for my questions, because I find after 3 papers, one's often sort of really forgotten what wanted to ask. So now I can look back. So yeah, I'll just paraphrase. I'm coining the acronym ACN for apocalyptic crime novel. How different, Andrew, would you say it is from, for example, the very familiar sort of urban crime novel that I'm sure we've all read many examples of? I'm reading Kent Anderson right now, which is set in 1970s Portland. And there's very much this sense of an apocalypse going on and the social contract fraying or disintegrating in front of the police detective's eyes. And of course, 1970s was also sort of a high watermark for more traditional apocalyptic fiction. Does that make sense as a question, Andrew?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say, kind of there are obviously sort of very close, kind of mirrorings or sort of, kind of overlaps there. And so in, kind of formally speaking, probably actually sort of, because, one of the parts of the question was looking at ideas of form, I'd say very similar because, you're trying to sort of, kind of sort of meld a kind of a set of conventions, which is trying to solve or expose or explain something. You're trying to kind of use those to kind of map breakdown, to map sort of social breakdown. So the two are sort of, kind of working in tension. So kind of was interested in, kind of Coralie's sort of, kind of claim about tension in one of the other questions. So tension being one of the constituents features of kind of society more generally, and also sort of crime fiction. I suppose sort of, kind of where the apocalyptic sort of story might be different is in the sense of the impossibility of anything ever being put back into place. So I'm thinking about the sort of, the kind of the exemplary story of a social breakdown, which might be something like kind of Dashiell Hammett's sort of Red Harvest, which sort of tracks that. But ultimately, in the end, the op hands Poisonville back to Wilson, kind of all cleaned up and ready to go to the dogs again, as he puts it. So sort of, there is some sense that sort of, things can be put back together. If you follow the kind of apocalyptic scenario to its logical conclusion and you don't kind of sort of back away from it, there is no sort of way that can ever happen. So there's sort of, something interestingly sort of, that is happening in the context or the circumstances, which means that sort of move, that final move, just can't take place. Now, obviously, sort of, writers, some, kind of for good reasons, for not so good reasons, kind of always want to kind of pull back from that and give us some kind of hope and, look towards futurity and some sense of sort of, society sort of, kind of, reimagining itself, kind of from the rubble. And so the same logic takes over. And that's where I think the kind of the story of sort of, urban breakdown and, kind of social collapse and the sort of apocalyptic novel probably share very, very close, kind of, similar sort of features. So, kind of there, a few thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, I would have to unmute now. Caroline, I believe you're next.
Thank you all to the panelists. It's amazing papers, and it's a real token that at 6 a.m. that I can listen to them with such attention. I just was interested in, Andrew, your point that you said, you talked about you suggested that there might be a kind of shadow social contract between reader and writer. And I was interested in that, particularly as a sort of the reader as a version of we're still here, right? If there's been this kind of incredibly bleak, if novel after novel just paints a very, very bleak picture, sort of what's left afterwards. But it seems like as long as you have a reader or a writer who's telling the story, you're kind of reenacting that social contract. And I just wondered if you would say a little bit more about that incredibly fruitful idea that you raised.
Yeah, and you've explained it sort of, kind of sort of brilliantly there. And I sort of, just add to that sort of, within kind of crime fiction, there are always a set of, kind of assumptions that sort of that shape that sort of relationship between, kind of writer-reader. So sort of writer-reader genre are in a kind of, sort of triangular sort of relationship where we as readers bring certain expectations to, kind of all sort of crime novels. And, those expectations are either, kind of met or not or complicated. And that's sort of part of the expectations we bring. Now, I suppose I'm, sort of I haven't given enough thought, or I'm not enough an expert on sort of readership sort of studies to sort of make particularly kind of, sort of definitive sort of, statements here. But, it strikes me that my own assumptions about readers as a sort of generality are kind of problematic, because I sort of, assuming that sort of readers do want, there to be some kind of order delivered, or sort of, readers of crime stories do want explanations, do want order, do want some kind of, sort of return, do want these sort of things, do want justice. And I think of my own experience of reading these novels, say, and I read sort of, say, Wendig's Wanderers, and I'm thrilled by the idea of, kind of protagonist after a protagonist dying off. I love that. I love that sort of sense of difference, the sense of my own expectations as readers being sort of frustrated and sort of, taken somewhere else, and sort of having to think, well, what's going on here? Sort of, how can this be happening? Surely there's going to be some kind of sort of redress here, but it never happens, or it doesn't happen right until the very end, at which point most of the characters we've had in this very long novel have died. And I think I sort of love that. And maybe other people love that too. So my own assumptions about readership, kind of are probably wrong, or probably need to be sort of, sort of challenged in relation to, sort of, kind of, I don't know, sort of other notions of thinking about readership more generally. So anyway, there are a few thoughts on that sort of really interesting question about sort of readers and writers and kind of genre as well.
Thank you.
You mentioned they create this. There's a movement in the novels between they're not about the future. They're framed to interrogate the here and now. So in some ways, they are exhorting readers to reflect on actions, particularly in the present, and which can lead to perhaps a breakdown in the social contract later. And here I'm thinking of Antti Tuomainen's The Healer in particular, with its critique of everyday capitalist practices. But I don't have a question, so I will pass on to our next person, who I believe is Coralie.
Oh, hello. Can everyone hear me? I hope you can. Good. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Andrew and Barbara, and did we have Carlos? Thank you very much. They were such fascinating papers. So my question to Andrew was about tension in the crime novel, in crime fiction in general. So do you think this might be a factor in the fusion of the detective crime drama with the apocalyptic themes to solve the impossibility of the wicked problem of climate change, for example? Tension and resolution are the keystones of crime fiction and detective crime fiction. Everything's solved at the end and normality is restored. Do you think there's also a tension going on here between nihilism and optimism, possibility and impossibility? Are there these forces pulling against each other in these texts?
Okay, yeah, a really interesting question. Sort of, kind of thanks so much for that. And I think that sort of, that general notion of tension is, I'd absolutely agree. I think that's sort of fundamentally what, the kind of crime novel is all about. And perhaps sort of holding, kind of these, kind of irreconcilable sort of ideas in tension with one another without necessarily sort of resolving them sort of, kind of in one way or the other. I mean, they're perhaps the more interesting sort of crime novels that are able to do that, to hold these sort of, kind of irreconcilable sort of ideas. Kind of you talked there at the end about sort of, kind of optimism and sort of nihilism, to hold those both in sort of focus at the same time without necessarily sort of coming down on one side or the other. I mean, I think that's what makes the sort of, kind of, the genre so exciting in terms of sort of dealing with, these sort of big questions and sort of big issues. I mean, it struck me listening to Stuart and sort of Carlos at the end there, sort of, thinking about the kind of social contract and the sort of subject, for our discussions today, the fact that sort of, the state itself may be responsible, both for the conditions that sort of give us sort of the freedom to kind of, to live, to exist, and so on, and yet also are kind of responsible for the kind of the very conditions that produce crime, and hence crime fiction in the first place. I mean, that's the sort of, that's a key sort of constitutive sort of fundamental tension that we're thinking about today, but a tension that's sort of, kind of embedded, I think, in crime stories and crime stories like the ones that sort of, kind of Barbara was talking about as well. So, yeah, I think sort of, kind of tension that is not resolved is sort of, that not resolved and perhaps not resolvable is sort of where I would want to sort of place the emphasis here.
Thank you. Yes, I was interested to see your reference to Lauren Ballant's work, Cruel Optimism, in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of, kind of for me, sort of, and I think for the project that I'm trying to work on, sort of, kind of Ballant's work, I mean, as I'm sure is the case for sort of many, kind of is so important because it allows us, sort of, I'm thinking about kind of Carlos's point about sort of ongoingness. It allows us to think about not sort of, kind of crisis that sort of, kind of comes about and produces, kind of a moment of rapture and then sort of catharsis. So everything is kind of solved or resolved. To think about the kind of ongoingness of crisis or crisis ordinariness, as she puts it. And to think about sort of how genres change, kind of in relation to that ongoingness of crisis. So yeah, I think sort of, kind of, I love that book, and I think her work is incredibly important in trying to sort of, kind of open up this particular kind of, field or these kind of questions.
Yes, thank you.
Now, if you'll indulge me to break the contract which we have, and that is to skip some questions, because I'm conscious that several of the questioners are the same people. And our next question is from Amy to Barbara. Amy, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, sure. I was a bit late. I missed Andrew's presentation, unfortunately. I was negotiating the social contract with my daughter. But I'll go to my question. I'm thinking about, I'm a big fan of film noir, and I haven't actually read any of the books that Barbara was presenting on. They're very fascinating. I'm adding particularly the study in Lilac to my list, but I was interested in the role of the female detective as hard-boiled detective, because often the hard-boiled detective, they seem like in a position of clarity, but usually the process of the story, they're thrown into some kind of confusion, and particularly in, say, Bound or Dorothy Porter's The Monkey's Mask, you've got the female neo-noir sort of detective. How is this enacting of the social contract happening, do you think, with this female detective?
Okay, so thank you for your question. Yeah, the hard-boiled narrative in the case of feminist crime fiction is more often than not is a sort of a trajectory that the detective experience. So she starts with some ideas, and then the case makes them either make very difficult choices and change the perspective, or allows them to see things with more clarity at the end. So normally there is this sort of parable or trajectory that see an evolution in the detective itself. I like your idea of the social contract, because it comes back in other questions that I read in the chat. So because some what I see it, and I like your idea of a sort of an alternative social contract. So it's not, it's a social contract that is outside the law. So it does not replace the official social contract, but it needs to be outside the law because, as we said, the state doesn't allow women a real justice. So I see it more like not as much as a restoring of the social contract, but an alternative social contract outside the law. This is how I see it this kind of crime fiction. Yeah.
Oh, good. Thanks for that. I also think it's interesting because I think the law is very rational, but it's actually fairly nonsensical. There's this group of rules that we've developed and, we need this evidence to prove rape and we need this motive, et cetera, et cetera. But the emotion, often feminism or feminist literature or feminist philosophy is more emotional. And we're like, oh, well, those are stupid though. Like that's not something to base a contract on. But in a sense, that's what the detective is doing. They've fixated on something. And in like The Last Policeman as well, Ben Winters, he's sort of fixated on something, an idea of justice that he's developed as well.
Yeah, and there is also this tension between what is legal and what is fair. So more often than not, what is legal is not necessarily, it does not deliver real justice. So our bold feminist detective negotiate with this, the idea of legality versus fairness a lot.
Yeah, it's awesome that the female detective makes actually a lot more sense in that sense because they're trying to forge a completely different social contract of what is right. Yeah. Thanks. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Good. Our next question is also for Barbara from Eric this time, and then Andrew.
Okay, let me jump in. I'll have to get back up to my list. Is this? Am I dropping below? Here I am. Am I going below Amy or above?
It was about the Gothic.
Yes, I'm with you, Barbara. Yeah, so I guess in a way I'm pushing back on your reading of Stieg Larsson's Män som hatar kvinnor, and I think the reading you're proposing is a pretty widely accepted reading and a solid reading, but it strikes me that it is such a fantastic novel. So that on the one hand, well, it seems to be really trying to establish the patriarchy, the government, society, right-wing elements in Swedish political and governmental systems, the secret services, the wealthy, the conservative, as the ultimate sort of perpetrators who underlie these horrors that are going on in the novel. The fact that it is so elaborate, that it is so over the top in its violence, and it ties into the question that I think Caroline followed up with about more violence porn, whether that sort of works against what Stieg Larsson might have been trying to achieve. I know we're moving into author intentionality and so on here.
To some extent, yes, it goes against it. And it's probably the only case because both in Voci and in Studying Lilac, there is not such danger of falling into a sort of exploitation of violence and spectacularization of violence to some extent. And so I agree with you in this respect. But I was also thinking, and I was thinking about this while I was reading my presentation and thinking about what Andrew was saying about this new hybrid form of crime fiction. And I'm asking you something back to you and asking, what do you think about it? Violence against women and rape and incest, they are so horrid that we may need to use horror elements.
I think that's a really strong argument. Yeah. Yeah.
So we may need to use, and I was thinking because in Voci also, the victim, Angela Bari, before dying, has sent in fact to the journalist fairy tales. So she recorded the fairy tales and sent the cassette to the investigator. And fairy tales are so full of Gothic and horror elements. And there are a lot of fathers killing their own daughters or preventing them from being happy. And there are women being cut into pieces and so on and so forth. So there is, to some extent, a sort of a Gothic and horror element in Voci too, even though it's not so extreme like in Men Who Hate Women. But I'm just wondering, is such an horrific issue that we may need horror elements. So we need a sort of a hybrid form of crime fiction to address it to some extent. Yeah,
it's a good point. And just really quickly against my own argument, my mother-in-law, who is a Swedish woman of an older generation, and when she first read Stieg Larsson's work, she was thrilled because it expressed something that she, I think, had felt her whole life and no one had ever articulated. And I think it took that almost exaggerated level of energy and intensity and anger to break a threshold of expression, as it were. So yeah, thank you for that.
Now, Andrew, has Barbara sort of answered your question, or is there more there to ask?
No, absolutely. No, I think she answered it brilliantly. I suppose, it's that sort of more general question. I'm sort of thinking about, your book, Stuart, with Alistair and Jesper, that sort of, the sort of mobility of sort of crime fiction, kind of has always been a sort of, kind of feature of, kind of the genre. So what are we talking about now, maybe in relation to gendered violence or some of these subjects that I'm, kind of bringing up? What are we talking when we're talking about sort of, the kind of movement between, kind of different generic frameworks, that kind of perhaps move outside of the kind of crime story to accommodate horror or, kind of war or apocalyptic stories or SF or fantasy or speculative fiction? Is that an extension of sort of, that move that your book sort of, kind of investigated so well? And is there a sort of, a question of extent here, maybe, that sort of, kind of, Barbara was sort of talking about just then? It's so horrific what these stories are trying to map that it requires a move to incorporate other generic forms. But yeah, Barbara sort of, kind of answered that question, really, really well. So.
Great. I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious that Carlos has presented, and we've got a few questions before we technically get to him. But I'm going to skip and ask Diana to present your question, and then we'll go to some of the other questions for Carlos, and then we'll go back to Barbara and Andrew, if that's okay.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I didn't know anything about Cuba police series, I have to confess, even though I work on Cuba crime fiction, so it was very interesting. My question was more about the reflection from the part of the viewers in Cuba, because what you said about the series and the way it is framed in terms of the didactic function speaks a lot about the classic rhetoric of the revolution in terms of cultural policy and what they aim to do from the winning of the revolution until nowadays. But as you said before, the social contract has been at least partially broken in Cuba, as we saw with the huge movement manifestation that took place in July. So I was wondering to what extent the Cuban viewers nowadays actually feels identified with the series or buys into this rhetoric of didactic and let's all embrace the revolutionary values that still obviously the revolutionary try to keep up.
Thank you, Diana, for the question. I think it's probably an impossible question to answer, because in Cuba and like many other countries, there are no studies of share or viewers' perceptions of television. I guess the Cuban television has the view that they are not a commercial television. Therefore, how much people like their programs is somehow unimportant, because this is a didactic television. So it's very difficult to see. But a couple of things that you can see. For example, in Cuba, because not everybody has access to internet, or it's almost impossible to download things from internet, you can buy what they call a paquete, or there are places where you go with your USB and you buy television series. Anything from the world you can buy for a very modest price. In all of them, one of the things they announce is we have Cuban cop shows, which means that people are really buying them by the ton. So they are very, very popular. One of the shows is still to this day, one of the Pali, they did some some study among people, I think in their 50s or 60s, what they remember of television. And apparently the thing they most remember was one specific episode in a crime police show, even more than anything that had been broadcast on television. However, on the other hand, it is true that crime fiction today in Cuba has two lines. One is the more traditional line, like Tras la Huella, which does not sell any books at all. So that some of crime fiction is not selling. Leonardo Padura and other people that do a complete different crime fiction, they are the people who sell. So it's a bit of it's going both ways. So it's still on television, it's very popular, but in the written form, people definitely have moved on from that sort of extremely conservative kind of crime fiction.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Eric also had a question for Carlos.
I did, and it may, again, my apologies for asking so many questions. They were just three really interesting papers. So it may not be an answerable question, Carlos. We're throwing hard ones at you. But I'm just wondering how the show you discussed, first of all, the title in English, how would it translate?
Yeah, sorry. Tras la Huella, actually, it's I think it's a pen because it has two possible translations. Tras la Huella is simply searching for clues, maybe.
Okay.
But it's also it's the idea that you are following on someone else's work. So it's playing on the continuity of the revolution. We are doing exactly what people did before against the Americans, and so yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. So, I mean, it sounds from the outside like a very obviously sort of ideological program that wears its ideology on its sleeve. But as someone very embarrassingly pointed out to me once, we don't see our own ideologies. We only see the ideologies of other people. So I'm wondering how different would this be from, and the example I've used here in the chat box was COPS, which I think was canceled in 2020, which, it's not a government. It doesn't, the Ministry of Information isn't behind it, but it still really embodies a really thick slice of American ideology. So is it kind of doing the same thing?
No, I think you are completely right, because I remember COPS, I remember that very well because I have to admit that I liked it. And it does have exactly the same ideology, from the original song. No, what you're going to do when they come for you? It's like, so watch out, the police is out there. We are always going to win. So in a sense, I think that the question is extremely interesting because I'm writing something about Tras la Huella at the moment, so I'll have to include that. To what extent do other series not do exactly the same, and we don't see it? But because it appears Ministry of Interior, so you don't need to be made by or produced by the Ministry of Interior to uphold the same views to some extent. Yeah,
especially that question of the selection of crimes that are presented for public condemnation, which I thought was really interesting. The way you picked that out, it could be an interesting comparison.
I'm sure there is someone also in COPS selecting exactly what they are going to show. No? COPS was more, if I'm not wrong, it was real footage and it was documentary. And Tras la Huella is acted, so it's right. Acted based on real facts, but it's acted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Sharon has a question for Barbara. Sharon.
Good morning. Well, it's very early morning where I am. Yes, I was really interested to hear your discussion of those sort of heavy, dark novels, and I wonder how you think your analysis of women protagonists would be reflected among the many cozy mysteries where the investigators are entirely amateur women with no training and no official standing in any government sense, and yet their goal is clearly to restore order and some form of a social contract within their communities.
Yes. So you're thinking about like Miss Marple or this so-called. Well, when we think about crime fiction, we always think about subgenre, and it makes sense because it helps us, categorizing and discussing things more rationally. And normally the convention says that the classic detective fiction, there is this restoration of the social order at the end. It's very reassuring, and there is no social criticism, as opposed to the hard-boiled or the noir subgenres where, social issues are tackled. I'm not so sure that it always works that way. I wouldn't divide it so in black and white. Stuart, I think you did with wasn't Jasper an Agatha Christie analysis demonstrating, or it was just you, I don't remember, sorry, demonstrating that Agatha Christie, in fact, even in Agatha Christie, there is some sort of criticism of the social order, and they are not so cozy after all.
Yeah, on Murder in the Orient Express, for example, yeah.
Yeah, so the so-called feminist crime fiction officially is born in the 1980s, but if we think about Dorothy Sayers and previous, crime novels, they are not necessarily hard-boiled. They bring forward a lot of ideas about the role of women in society, and the fact that Miss Marple, for example, solves the crimes by herself, and she's smarter than the police detective, who is a white middle-aged man. It has its own, value, I think. And I'm not an expert in that kind of crime fiction, so I cannot really say much about it. But I have read that there is now also a rereading of these crime novels, and showing that, in fact, there is a lot of social commentary, and they are more less cozy than you may think. But I'm not really the right person to go in depth with this answer.
Thank you.
I think there's been a revision of how cozy the cozies supposedly are, really, that's been going on for some time now. Chris, can I pass to you now to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, I slightly wrong-footed me there. Wonderful, wonderful presentations. Thank you, all three, ever so much. My particular question was to Andrew, although I guess that Barbara and Carlos would have really interesting things to say too, so do feel free to chip in. It's about one thing that you said almost in passing, Andrew, which was the role of crime fiction in interrogating worlds, I think was your language. And my question is, what does interrogating worlds mean in that context? And is it something that either only literature can do, or that literature does particularly well? And part of what's behind that question is it right to think of these novels as thought experiments about the social contract, for example, to use that language? Because a critique of using them in that way would be, well, they're not real. This is imaginative. This isn't playing out real scenarios, someone might say. But I wondered, sort of to counter that, whether there would be something to say in relation, for example, to Paul Ricoeur's idea of the world of the text as texts unfolding worlds for us, and whether that might help us to understand what interrogating worlds is. So the question is, what can literature, particularly crime fiction, do with and do to the social contract in terms of this idea of interrogating worlds?
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm not sure. I mean, sort of, in terms of sort of the idea of interrogating kind of worlds. Yes, very much a sort of, kind of passing sort of throwaway comment, and, kind of one, obviously I need to be more careful about nailing down. I mean, I think sort of, to answer your question, what can sort of literature, what can crime fiction do that sort of, kind of perhaps other sort of, forms of thinking, kind of, other forms of kind of knowledge, sort of, kind of other ways of sort of mapping, kind of reality, which is, itself, kind of obviously sort of, kind of contested and sort of unstable sort of, kind of term anyway. And sort of, kind of one could say, well, there's no reality outside of to develop the sort of, recur position, kind of, no reality outside language anyway. I'm not sure, sort of, I suppose sort of, kind of, for me, kind of crime fiction, is able to sort of get at some of the kind of knottier questions around the sort of social contract, because, its sort of constitutive elements are organized or orientated, kind of around, the questions of, sort of fairness, of obligation, kind of duty, of law, and all of these, the sort of, the kind of the fundamentals of the crime novel anyway, sort of, kind of address these questions. So then if we start to sort of think about sort of, the kind of social contract sort of more specifically, even if sort of, kind of crime writers don't think in those terms, don't specifically sort of address, sort of the social contract as sort of, political philosophy might do, sort of, those issues are still being, kind of, addressed, sort of, kind of developed, kind of unfolded, interrogated sort of more generally. I suppose, kind of the reference to world rather than worlds allow us to sort of, think about kind of multiple overlapping, kind of worlds anyway. So kind of worlds could mean, sort of, kind of a move from, the local to national to kind of global, but it could mean sort of, kind of, different social worlds that sort of, kind of impinge on one another and overlap, and crime fiction is able to sort of move between these worlds, but move between sort of individual worlds and sort of make connections between them. And sort of, in some ways then sort of, the unpicking of those connections, sort of, the sort of, the way in which sort of society, these worlds are not necessarily connected, but sort of, disconnected or fall apart, becomes an interesting sort of interrogation of, these sort of, the sort of social contract more generally. So I'm sort of, kind of thinking on my feet here and, kind of struggling to kind of answer your question particularly well. But, kind of it's definitely sort of something to sort of, to think more about, actually. So, kind of thank you for that. I mean, I suppose, sort of, the final sort of question I would have, for myself and others is, well, what are the implications for us, for society, for the genre, if we see the social contract as a choice rather than an obligation? But, kind of maybe that's a sort of question to other people and other sort of, people here. But anyway, thank you. I'll shut up now.
I think, conscious of the time, I think that's a great way to end with the question, so we can start thinking about this for another possible conversation. I just want to thank everybody for coming, and before we finish, I want to pass over to Chris just to say a few words.
Yes, very quickly indeed. Let me add my thanks to Stuart. It's been such a rich discussion. I've got so much to go away and think about, and I trust that we all have as well. So thank you ever so much for attending. Thank you for those who asked questions. I've just shared 2 links in the chat. The first is to the Monash Crime Fiction Project, if anyone is interested in looking at the work that is being done there. The second is to the Monash Social Contract Research Network. Again, you can see the sort of work we're doing there, if that's the sort of research that interests you. In terms of the Social Contract Research Network, the next seminar is on the 12th of October. And David Lyon from Queen's University in Canada, who's the former director of the Surveillance Studies Centre there, is going to be speaking about surveillance capitalism meets the pandemic. Is his title, Surveillance Challenges to the Social Contract. So if that's something that interests you, you can sign up for that on the second of the 2 links that I shared. And whether it's very late at night, very early in the morning, or somewhere in between, thank you ever so much for coming. And the recording of this will be posted on the Social Contract Research Network YouTube channel in a little while. And I will send a quick email out to you guys when that happens, so that you can listen back to anything that you didn't quite catch. Thank you.